Well, Trey, thanks a lot for being here. This is Trey Zoeller for the Brand Ambassador Series. And, well, back to Kentucky with the Jeffersons.
Absolutely.
We don't know enough about Jefferson. We see it now almost everywhere. You've got to tell us about it. What's behind that brand and all of these different labels?
Well, it's been kind of an evolution. My dad and I started the company back in 1997 when we had the opportunity to buy a line of bourbon that would have otherwise been discontinued because there was some consolidation in the industry. Had some wonderful 15-year-old bourbon that we were able to package up and put in a bottle, which we did under the Jefferson's Reserve label. And that was a great experience. I thought I'd go out, make a label, sell hundreds of thousands of cases, and that'd be a day. But things evolved, as I said. Since that time, we've launched Jefferson's, Jefferson's Reserve, Jefferson's Presidential Select, and just recently Jefferson's Rye. But they're not just one recipe per each bottling. What we've kind of evolved to, as I've been around in the industry for some time now, I've had the opportunity to buy these esoteric, smaller lots of bourbon.
Right.
A couple months ago, I bought some 20-year-old, some 14-year-old, and 10-year-old bourbon from different distilleries, different mash bills, that I will blend together in what we call ridiculously small batches of about 8 to 12 barrels for our bottlings of Jefferson and Jefferson's Reserve.
But you're saying that you'll be blending those ones. They each have a different mash bill?
Well, about 50% of the bourbon in both Jefferson and Jefferson's Reserve are from the same recipe, same mash bill, same barrels. A barrel with a lighter char, almost a number 1, number 2 char.
Oh, really?
Which allows a lot of flavors to come through that would typically be masked by a deeper char.
Ah.
So there is some characteristics that are similar. However, for instance, in the Jeffersons, we use bourbon as young as 6, and in this last bottling as old as 16 years old. About 30% of it is 16-year-old bourbon. And it is a little bit easier, more approachable, or as my friends would say, dangerous, because it does go down so easy, than the Jefferson's Reserve, which is much more complex, much more sophisticated, and that's because it's more time in the wood.
Right.
Typically, we use barrels between 12 and 18 years on the Jefferson's Reserve.
Okay.
So you're going to pick up a lot more character, a lot more time in the wood. Really comes out, especially with that smaller char.
Is it something that those distillers, when you go to those companies who have distilled the product and aged it, do they tell you right up front, well, you know, we've got these barrels that have become a bit special because there was a char number 1 or char number 2, or you know that this producer always works with a char number 2 and this one always with a number 4?
Flavian, it's different. Sometimes you know, the well's very dry and there's very limited amount of bulk bourbon to take a look at. But when there is these special opportunities out there, I like to pounce on them. Great example is the Jefferson's Presidential Select. I got a call from one of the larger companies that said they had 400 barrels available from the Zoeller distillery.
Right.
A special wheat bourbon that you're very familiar with.
Yeah.
And asked if I might be interested.
You cannot say no to that. You've got to make sure that you call the bank or that you sell a lot of the others, because you just cannot say no.
When the opportunity like that presents itself, and I have something similar going on right now, I definitely want to take advantage of it.
So there are still great bourbons out there? Because we think as consumers, we think that everything that's great is just so held so tight by the producers themselves.
It is, actually. It's very rare when I get these calls. I actually bought the Presidential Select 3 years ago, and we kind of parceled it out in the last couple of years, so there's not a whole lot of juice left there.
Yeah.
But from time to time, there are these discoveries. I might ask them if they have anything 6 months prior, and they don't.
Yeah.
And they somehow appear, and sometimes there's something that I jump on, and sometimes I pass.
Let's talk about something that everybody is completely in love with already. That Jefferson's Reserve, 18 years old, that is the current edition. Last year, it was 17-year-old.
The Jefferson's Presidential Select, yes.
So is it becoming a 19-year-old?
Actually, it's 19 years. This month, it's a 20-year-old bourbon.
All right.
It was actually distilled in December of 1991. So what is bottled as an 18-year-old in this case is, we bottled it up a few months ago, so that would have been a 19 and three-quarter year bourbon.
So you still keep some?
Absolutely, we keep some back. The 17-year-old, the difference between the 17 and the 18, it had a birthday, so it had more time in the wood.
And it was very different.
Very different.
Still amazing, but very, very different.
Absolutely, and as a matter of fact, we felt that it was getting too much time in the wood. And on our last bottling, we did something that was kind of unique and I think really added to what this experience is going to be like with the Presidential Select.
And what was that?
We added 30% of a 20-year-old rye bourbon. So in essence, you have a 4-grain bourbon in the Jefferson's Presidential Select. 70% of it's still the Trey Zoeller wheat bourbon. Now we have 4 grains. It's very nicely balanced, and that rye kind of almost stifled a little bit of the wood that was coming out that might have been too prevalent.
Yeah. Because when it's wheat that is used as a flavor grain, what are the big differences as it ages that you see with the rye as the flavor grain?
Well, and I tell you what, honestly, I'm not the biggest fan of wheat bourbons when they're younger.
Yeah, but when you drink something like this, you've got to love it.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. The wheat really balances out the hyper-aging, you know, the big influence of the wood. The wheat really balances it out nicely and doesn't compete like a rye may. However, the rye gives an added component where you're getting more flavors. You're getting some of that spice in there as well as some of the balance from the wheat. So there's just more going on with it. It's more complex that way.
What would you say is the ratio right now in the bourbon industry of bourbons using a rye as a flavor grain in the mash bill and wheat?
Oh gosh, well there's only 4 or 5 wheat bourbons out there. Maker's Mark being the largest. So I would say 10% might be a stretch using wheat.
Right.
So probably less than 5.
And it's even more rare that you would let it age for so long.
I doubt it was anybody's intention when it was originally distilled to let it sit in the wood for 20 years. But you know,
it's a gamble because in this business, when you make bourbon, you don't make it to age for so long. Usually, you plan on what 8, 9 years old, and this is about it. This is already old enough.
8, 9 years is a long time in bourbon life. You know, when you're in new barrels, you get so much more of the influence of the wood than you would in used barrels. 8, 9 years is a long time. So, and it's a long time to put down your investment.
Right.
Your money's tied up for those, you know, for a decade. What other business do you know you're not going to have a return on your investment for that period of time?
See here, we get the bottles, we sell them right away.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
But when you get the barrels, do you keep on aging them?
We do.
Oh,
we do.
So you don't just
we don't put them in stainless
right
steel. Some of it we bottle, but you know, the Presidential Select I've had for 3 years. Some of the 20-year-old that we're about to put in Jefferson's Reserve, we've had for 2.5 years. Some of it we've had 5 years. So we age some of it and we bottle some of it right away. So we're trying to anticipate what it's going to taste like a couple years down the road and what it's going to blend best with. So
do you have to taste and smell every day?
Not every day, but it's a big part of my job, which
somebody's
got to do it.
This smells lovely.
It is, and again, I attribute it to a couple things, the uniqueness of it. One is the 50% of the barrels that do have that lighter char in the barrel, which allows so many different flavors to come through. Typically, it's more of your fruit flavors, floral flavors that come out that would be masked by a deeper char. So that's something that's very evident as you smell and taste this.
It's really, really, really fragrant.
Absolutely. And for a lower proof bourbon, this is 82.3 proof. And I've proofed all of these where I think they're best drink, neater on the rocks.
Oh, so you don't go by a standard, say, 80, 86, 92?
No, and certainly there's reasons that people do that. However, you know, I play around with it until I think it's best. And each expression's that's at a different point.
So, are those producers that you're playing with quite a bit. Do these producers make some that they will age or keep in a certain area, and they're thinking Trey Zoeller for Jefferson?
Well, we do have that to some degree with, and I can't really contractually talk about what we have laid out. Others that I purchased from them when opportunity strikes. So it's a combination of the two.
But there are two faces to this business. You've got some that you know you can rely on because it's made there, and it's going to be what, the backbone of the
absolutely.
blend?
Correct.
And then you've got those beauties that you have to source.
Absolutely.
Do you have to go and beg?
There are times that, not that I've begged, but I'm certainly anxious to see what could be available and what we might have next. So, knock on wood, I'll continue to have these opportunities, and we'll continue to have great offerings.
What about those producers who make vintages? Is this something that you'd be looking at? That you'd like some producers to approach you and say, look, I've got 20 barrels of 1989.
And that's what happens. That's as I mentioned, a couple months ago, about 60 days ago, I bought some 20-year-olds, some 14 and some 10-year-old. All three different lots, different producers, and they have different characteristics. So, when I get that opportunity, that's great. And we had, with that, we probably turned down. There were years, all years in between, that I turned down.
Yeah.
It just didn't fit for us. Not to say they weren't good, they just didn't fit.
Do you sell your bourbons just about everywhere in the U.S.?
Just about. Well, certainly.
Bourbons and rye, I should say.
Bourbons and rye, absolutely.
There's a rye now that you've got to talk about.
You bet.
But all across the U.S.
For the most part, throughout the, we're in 50 states. I should say we're in 48 states. So we're pretty much throughout the country, and at your bigger, more specialized stores, we're certainly available. We're trying to grow that all the time.
Well, and you're traveling quite a bit, so I know you're working hard on that. Is the West Coast drinking it differently than the East Coast?
I tell you what, the West Coast, I just got back from Washington State, and it was amazing. Certainly the rye, they are in love with ryes right now, as they are esoteric bourbons. They're smaller batches, single barrels. They really have a great knowledge and thirst for it. And yes, they seem to be drinking more cocktails, in Washington at least.